I'm Jenny Kwan. I'm the Member of Parliament for Vancouver East.
My name's Garth Mullins, and I'm I guess I'm a harm reduction activist and a trade unionist and a podcaster, radio documentary maker.
The NDP has a long-standing policy on harm reduction. In fact, when I was the provincial member of the Legislative Assembly, we have been pushing for the government to come forward with allowing for the supervised injection facility here in Vancouver.
This is my second overdose crisis. So for me, my knowledge of harm reduction started the last one, which was in the 90s, and really strong heroin was dropping someone around here every day. And people were starting to organize to do something about it.
At that time, many people, in fact, were dying. There were people in our community whose lives were lost. We did a community event where 1,000 crosses were planted at a local park, Oppenheimer Park, and each of them had a name of a loved one, somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's aunt, somebody's uncle, somebody's friend.
Mostly as drug users, we experienced the drug war and all the criminalization as individuals, isolated by ourselves. And so a few people started to call for meetings in a park. And even I was incredulous, like, we are unorganizable. We're so fucked up right now. But we came together, people started putting their ideas down. And one of the things that people realized was we need somewhere where people can give help, a safe injection site. And that's where harm reduction in Vancouver really started, was opening safe injection sites. And that happened without permission, against the law, illegally, kind of on the down low first. And that was done a couple of times before eventually the people in charge were embarrassed into opening an official one.
In fact, the mayor of Vancouver at that time, Philip Owen, for the longest time, he was not on side in support of harm reduction. And I remember sitting at that table as the provincial representative, working with our municipal representative, and in talking with our then health minister, federal government, Alan Rock. He actually said, bring the municipalities on side, and then I will grant you that authority. And that's what he said to me when I was in Ottawa. So I came back and redoubled my effort to say, okay, I got to bring the local mayor on side with Philip Owen. And at that table, when under the Vancouver Agreement, as we were working on this, it was very, very difficult. We move a step forward and then we kind of move several steps back. And it wasn't just quite there when every time I put the issue of the supervised injection facility on the table, we would just all sort of walk around in circles. So finally I said to Philip, Philip, people in the downtown Eastside community, maybe you should go speak with them. Maybe you should just visit them. And you realize that they're just people just like you and me. And the truth of the matter is that we can do something about it. We could save lives. Can we put aside partisan politics for 1 minute and do something for the lives of the people in our community who depend on us with a policy change? Because that's what we could do, right? And so anyway, pushing Philip to sort of look at it differently. And so one day he did, actually, to his credit, he did go down to the downtown east side, and he told me he stood at the corner of Main and Hastings and he observed what was going on. And he talked with some people, and then he came away and said, you know what, Jenny, you're right. Let's do this. And then we were able to bring him on side, and ultimately that's when the federal government said, okay, you guys have aligned what you needed to do, and then the supervised injection facility became a reality. To be honest with Philip, in signing on with this harm reduction initiative and this approach, what we call 4 pillars approach at that time, he lost the support of his party, and his own party members went after him relentlessly. And he ultimately did not run again for mayor. And I think supporting this initiative cost him his mayoralty seat ultimately because of the internal pressures that were put on him. But I said to Philip, Philip, you've made such a huge difference in the lives of people. You can be so very proud of yourself that you've done something that really mattered, and you've saved lives. Let's be clear about that. You have saved lives. After we were successful in getting the first supervised injection facility, Insite, into play, the federal government did try to change all of that under the Harper administration. And in fact, we could not get our authority renewed, actually, our exemption renewed under the Harper government. So the community actually had to take the government to court, and the Portland Hotel Society, along with users, in the community, actually took that on. We had Joe Arve, a renowned charters right lawyer, do this work on a pro bono basis, and we fought this all the way to the Supreme Court and won. So yes, I think that the Conservatives will always be a threat, but ultimately we must never give up. And the right thing to do on so many levels is to ensure that all people are treated with the health care support that they need, and that addictions is a health issue, and that we must act accordingly. And with the opioid crisis that we have, it is a national health emergency. It's not happening just in the downtown east side of Vancouver. It is happening across the country. It's happening in small communities, albeit in smaller scale, but it is happening. And to pretend otherwise, we're only just fooling ourselves. And by doing that, we are costing lives. And that to me is not acceptable. Had it not been for the people of Vancouver East, the activists in the community, the user community, the families who's lost loved ones, joining hands in pushing forward, I don't think we would have achieved what we have achieved today. So I think there's much to be learned from Vancouver East.
We're both located in Victoria, so that's one part of all of British Columbia's harm reduction. But I think British Columbia has been a leader in harm reduction. So in politically, I think as we've actually had to politicize, like our government has been harm reduction leaders and internationally. And so we've had harm reduction as a health policy since 2005 in our government. But more importantly, I think harm reduction as a movement has been very strong on the west coast of North America, of the continent, but also including in Vancouver and Victoria. There's a long history of harm reduction activism. And people often think of that in Vancouver-based, the downtown east side base, but it's definitely more than that. It's also been in Victoria, and including AVI in the early HIV with needle exchange and such.
And goes back to the street association, right? Really,
yeah.
I mean, that was...
Yeah, since the early 90s, we've had both sanctioned and unsanctioned needle distribution and condom distribution. And I think there's always been some history of having sanctioned health authority services, but also having more community-based and a stronger outreach teams. I think we've, and over the years we've lost more and more around outreach as a harm reduction role. That's a funded role, but I think we still have the movements.
There's been a really strong movement for harm reduction services and community building and organizing in Victoria for years. Bruce and I have both been involved with that movement for over 10 years, more like 15 or more, 20 for you probably. And it's been consistently a really strong community organizing effort. And I think the involvement and the leadership of people who use drugs in that movement has been really crucial to what we have here today, which is actually a decent amount of services and supports for people who use drugs. There's definitely more that needs to be done, of course. And we're losing too many people. But we're a long way from where we used to be. I started working in needle exchange 15 years ago, and I remember having, needles, and I think we were just phasing out of one-to-one exchange at that point, and we had very little else. So we didn't have cookers, we didn't have tourniquets, things like that. So we've gone from that and having a really strong community backlash and a lot of NIMBYism to now having multiple places where people can use drugs. Both government sanctioned and community based.
The overdose crisis and the fact that our government actually has named it a public health emergency and used the public health emergency has made it harder for people who disagree to be able to voice an opinion. It's pretty hard for people to express their hatred in the face of so many deaths, but the hatred's still there.
And it's sort of shifted, right? Like we had a tent city here over the last couple of years that received a lot of attention and a lot of hate. And the community, there was a community of people that really organized in that hatred. And that was sort of more directed towards people who are homeless. But of course, that included people who use drugs, and it was just different language that they were using. So I feel like the NIMBYism has sort of, as Bruce said, sort of gone a bit more underground, but it's still there and it manifests in different ways. And it's still a huge barrier for folks. And the pushback on that has been consistent and really important as well, because in the case of Tent City, for example, you know, that effort of people putting their bodies on the line resulted in more housing in Victoria. And, you know, it's questionable whether the housing that we got was the housing that people were asking for, but that direct action resulted in change. So there's this constant push and pull, pushback against NIMBYism, which I think is still there in different shapes and forms.
I think that there's a lot of more acceptance or welcoming of people with lived experience being involved in decision making and having a voice, and it's much more now about saying how can that be done in not only a meaningful way but in a really a respectful way, and being respectful of people's vulnerabilities and doing some of that. Inclusion is like changing everything around the person, not changing that person, not trying to just take somebody out and then saying now you're a spokesperson, and not addressing all of that context. And so we'll have health authorities or people, policymakers saying, you know, nothing about us without us sort of like spouting these type of things, but then still criminalizing the person and then saying, but then we want you on radio talking about drugs when we're going to criminalize you at the exact same day, the exact same moment. So there's so many contradictions in including a peer voice or a lived experience voice that I think needs to really be grappled with. And as people work in the movement and activism, like, you know, it's really hard work to do that, and to do it in a way that is safe for everybody, and not just safe, but that we all benefit from it and respect, like that people actually gain from it, that they're not, we're not causing harm by including people. And I think that that's been a real struggle for harm reduction as a movement, and I think it's not considered enough in the more mainstream public health models.
British Columbia certainly is the leader across Canada in terms of progress, in terms of rolling out harm reduction in all its forms. In the Lower Mainland, especially, Victoria is getting better. We need more treatment. We need more acknowledgement of mental health issues, more acknowledgement and treatment and funds going into mental health, so that people don't feel the need to start mitigating their pain with drugs in the first place. Here we are in the Lower Mainland, especially, making some progress in safer supply, where many physicians and clinics are either doing it de facto or are in the process, have been doing it for a long time. However, people are dying at 4+ a day in BC still, especially out of the communities, out of the larger communities, up in the rural areas, up north, up island, here, up Vancouver Island. There's struggles in the community with safer supervised consumption sites. For any harm reduction measures, there's a lot of misunderstanding and ignorance really around what it is. The evidence shows us that with supervised consumption sites, crime actually goes down. A lot of communities think crime's going to go up because these people come into their community. Well, it's absolutely not true. It doesn't bear out in the statistics. People, meeting people where they're at, having the supervised consumption sites in areas where people congregate anyway is the thing to do. So we, at Mum Stop the Harm, we advocate for these lower barrier, evidence-based means of implementing all harm reduction measures. We've struggled really hard for the progress we've made with the federal government. they at least are aware. They at least are working on anti-stigma. They at least are rolling out funds, sanctioning supervised consumption sites. They're inching forward, and we've been fighting this. Well, we've been fighting this for 3 years, and 4 years really, and other people for decades. If we lose that, it's unimaginable, but it could happen. And so we're preparing for that fight to scale back up to where we are now if some of the bad things happen.
Here in Victoria for 12 years we fought to try to get a safe consumption site, and when you get those 11 booths, it's pretty disheartening to see that was 12 years of activism. And for sure I think we did a lot more than that, and we did a lot of community building, and we really did some solidarity. There's a lot of great things, and the drug user movement I think is really strong. But I think I feel for myself it's a real lesson about the pitfalls of arguing for services and policy change as a movement, and how do we go bigger. But then I'm also not sure how do we do a movement that's not so outside of people's daily realities, so to try to take on the whole world and all its problems is hard also.
We will never give up. We also know that some very high-level politicians are with us. We have allies in Health Canada. People are beginning to understand that the evidence-based information around drug use and drug addiction and overdose, the epidemic we have of overdose, is solvable.
I think it's one of the challenges of having a public health crisis is that a lot of what might be looked at as being a gain is also temporary. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of all the overdose prevention sites that have been open in the province have none of them are assured to continue past the public health emergency in British Columbia, and so we'll have to be trying to argue for that and resist for some of that to continue. And so I think people have often said the public health is devastating, and it would be really devastating if we didn't make huge political gains while it's on. We don't also make sure that we're really fighting while we have this opportunity to really shift things because of the crisis. And it's this really horrible sort of opportunistic way that it's looked at. But there is this knowing that it could all go back to the way it was before, or even worse. So I think, there's nothing that says that anything is going to continue for harm reduction. I don't think governments think that they're going to get more votes by doing more harm reduction still.
So we're from Ontario, so we have Doug Ford in power, and
Fuck Doug Ford. And fuck Jason Kenney. Jason Kenney, right for you. I think in Canada you have two major political streams that tend to be in government federally and for the most part provincially too. And there's sort of the political center or the political right. And the political center is we don't really care about you. Drug users, you're not voters, you don't have money, we don't really care about you. And on the political right, you have, actually, we'd be happy if you died, it's okay with us. And these are the two things we usually get to choose from. So, for the last several years, we've had we don't really care about you in office in Ottawa. And before that, we had Stephen Harper's, we don't mind if you die. And now we're having, we don't mind if you die, come to power provincially. So, we have these sort of points on the curve, but there's no political, there's no viable political entity right now that's able to form government that's going to come and say, oh yeah, we're going to end the drug war and we're going to get everybody out of this mess. So there's nobody offering that. There's basically adding a few things around the edges or taking them away. And don't get me wrong, safe injection sites are super important. We fought really hard for them and they need to be everywhere. But when you have a safe injection site, when you break open that ampule of Narcan, you're doing an intervention which is in the last few heartbeats of somebody's life. And we need to do things that are way upstream, that give people the kind of lives that aren't going to put them in danger of a fatal overdose to begin with. And so putting safe injection sites there is important. Taking them away is irresponsible and ludicrous. And that's what Doug Ford and Jason Kenney are doing. And that's why I say, fuck you, Doug Ford, and fuck you, Jason Kenney.
My name is Donald McPherson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. Okay, drug policy in Canada it's a policy framework that was designed in the early 1900s, and it's been in place for since then. It's originally based on a very punitive approach to people who use drugs. In 1929, the sentence for possession or trafficking, they didn't differentiate, was 7 years in prison, $1,000 fine, which was a lot of money in 1929, and whipping was at the discretion of the judge. Over the years, there's been slight modernizations in terms of lessening penalties for possession of under 30 grams of cannabis, those sorts of things. In the 90s, there was a harm reduction movement, 80s and 90s, a harm reduction movement which sort of pushed the limits of the drug policy towards supervised consumption services, and sort of the harm reduction area expanded. But still, the overriding framework is the criminalization of people who use drugs. More recently, we've seen cannabis become legalized, a legally regulated market for cannabis. So it's another stretching of our drug policy towards something a little bit different. And now we're in an era where there are so many overdose deaths in the country that we see that as a sign that this is the absolute, utter, catastrophic failure of our drug policy, and now is the time to radically transform it into something that actually works, is based on principles of public health, human rights, and decriminalizes people who use drugs and moves towards a legal, regulated market in drugs.
Well, I mean, the main stigma against drug users is in the law. You're a criminal, it's illegal. So the law is the main way how society decides what behavior is okay, who's kind of within the tent of civilization and who's an outcast. And so the law says that people like me are the others, they're outside. And that makes a huge difference to people, because when you're criminalized, when something you do is illegal, it means you've got to be on the down low about it. It means you're kind of underground. So we're often afraid to access health services. People use quickly, they use alone, they use in sort of risky circumstances. Sometimes they smash it all at once because they don't have time to try a little first and see if it's okay, because maybe there's police around. So yeah, criminalization that's where the stigma comes from.
Why have we regulated most substances? Most consumer products are regulated, including drugs, pharmaceutical products, alcohol, tobacco, and now cannabis. Why are we not regulating the other drugs? We regulate thousands of pharmaceutical products, very dangerous ones, powerful ones that people use every day. We regulate them. There's a way of accessing them. Why don't we regulate these other drugs that are killing so many people and trying to minimize the illegal market as much as possible? Oh,
the current situation is a clusterfuck. I mean, this is, like I was saying, the second crisis. So it's strong, adulterated drugs with fentanyl in them, and also pig dewormer and household detergent and brick dust, and sometimes benzos. So it's a cocktail. You're not sure what you're gonna get. It's all kinds of funny unicorn colors and purple and blue pebbles and orange this and that. And Yeah, so basically all this police response for decades and decades has meant that there's this arms race amongst drug manufacturers. So people who are making illegal drugs for sale on the street, they want to find something stronger and smaller and easier to smuggle around. And so you get, strong China white heroin in the 90s giving way to fentanyl now, which is slowly giving way to carfentanil. And it's that extra enforcement, it's that heavy-handed policing that's bringing us to the next and the next and the next.
The stigma on illegal drugs and the people who use them make it really hard for the public and politicians to understand why we would, soften our approach, it's like in the harm reduction movement, you're seen as enabling people's drug use, which is a crock. You're not enabling their drug use, you're enabling healthcare safety around them. You're enabling engagement. You're enabling a lot of good things. The drug use is happening anyways. And so it's the same thing with moving towards regulation. People say, one person said to me earlier today, well, what about you open the floodgates of regulation and more people will become addicted? And I said, the floodgates are open. These drugs are available in 24/7 in any community in Canada. It's like regulation's a radical experiment. No, it's not. It's what we do. We regulate everything. It's what we're doing now that is the experiment, and that experiment has failed miserably. Our politicians are very willing to play political games to get more support from their base, to play political games with people's lives. So shutting down supervised consumption services in the midst of Ontario's worst ever historic overdose crisis is just absolutely unconscionable and has nothing to do with needing more evidence. The evidence on harm reduction, the first supervised injection site was opened in Bern, Switzerland in 1986. There's a lot of evidence out there that says these things work as part of a comprehensive approach. They're not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, but they work. So they should be part of an approach, especially when you have HIV, Hep C, and overdoses. Especially then you need these kinds of services. And we have all those things. So it's so sad that this ideological sort of thrust from the conservative governments of Kenney and Ford, those are the two main ones that I'm hearing about. It's just so sad that they aren't listening to the families and parents and young people who've lost friends and family to the overdose crisis and are just dying to have a supervised place to protect their safety. Everyone should be calling on their politicians to do something safe, which is just designing a new process, designing a new model. They don't have to come down on the side of anything, but just let's get on with the change. And in the short term, I think this whole safe supply discussion will be a really important one. The more access to a safe supply of drugs people have will be will make more progress. Look what Trudeau did with cannabis, right? He saw that it had a lot of public support. Then, okay, we're going to do this. And they did it. They moved the dial on that one. So I think with harm reduction and safe supply and moving towards a regulated market, it's a matter of beginning the process, which means you have to agree that this thing isn't working anymore.
We've done a lot of harm reduction here. It has not been rolled out universally. So there's several pilots, but it's not everywhere. So if you want to try harm reduction, don't do it in half measures. Roll it out everywhere. And then you're going to realize that harm reduction doesn't actually go far enough. The problem is the drug supply is poisonous, and we got to deal with that right at the source. So we got to find a way to get a safe supply of drugs to people, or we're going to keep seeing the dying. So BC has harm reduction, and that's great. The deaths would be a lot higher here without the harm reduction methods. But if we're going to bring it down, if we're going to stop seeing, someone die in BC 4 times a day, we've got to go further.